You're listening to The Robin and Boom Show, engaging the contemporary world with the great tradition. Find us on our YouTube channel, our Facebook page, or on our website at robinmarkphillips.com or wherever you listen to podcasts. Now, here's today's co-host, Robin Phillips.
Hello, gentlemen. I'm joined with Keith Pimental and Jason Van Boom. Hello, gentlemen.
Hello. How are you?
Hello.
We have an exciting discussion for you today, but first of all, we are giving away a free copy of Saints and Scoundrels to the person who submits the best question for us to discuss on a future podcast. What you do is you simply post a question on our Facebook page sometime between now and July 1st, and if your question wins, you will get a free copy of Saints and Scoundrels, and your question will be discussed on a future episode of this show. So it's something to look forward, something to aspire to. And who's the author of Saints and Scoundrels? I forget.
I think it's Robin Phillips.
Yes, there you go. You win.
Oh my God! No. The person who submits the question gets it. So
there you go. So we want to hear your questions, and we want to address them on future episodes of the show, because this is about helping you in your journey in life. So we're talking about tribalism. Tribalism, what is it, and what can we do to prevent it? Keith.
Yes. What can we do to prevent it? We can first of all be aware that tribalism exists, and that tribalism is, which many people say they're part of a tribe, but I don't think they really understand what that means, what tribalism means. So the first thing is we need to know that it exists and what it connotes. It connotes a subversion of one's intellectual evaluation, thought processes, the critical thinking skills to the critical thinking skills of a group. And that group is going to, by default, be led by those that are the most strong-willed and feel they have the most to gain from leading the group, which means a very small segment of that group will dictate what the tribe believes and does. Everyone in the tribe thinks they have a acknowledged or accepted membership or joined up, so to speak, by their own volition, and that everything is done by their own volition. This is kind of like what we talked about last week with Jason when he mentioned democracy. Everybody in the United States and many democracies in the West think that they're actually pulling the strings and running the show, and that on its face is, with any critical thinking, is just not true. The same goes for tribes. So the first way to inoculate is to be aware of what that means, who's running the tribe, what tribe you think you're part of, and whether you've actually consciously given an acknowledgement and agreement to the values and principles of that tribe. Okay, so
Keith, you're a parent. Jason, you're an educator. You're an educator of teenagers. How can we, as parents and educators, instill critical thinking in our youth?
Well, let's start with the tribalism bit. The first thing to recognize about tribalism is the attraction of the tribe. Why do people join the tribes? In a sense, belonging to a tribe or the attraction to tribes is inevitable. I think of it like gravity. We always have gravity. That doesn't mean that we are condemned to walking on all fours or maybe crawling along on the ground like a snake. We can actually even fly. We have airplanes. We can fly to outer space. Perhaps we'll fly to Mars. But it's because we recognize the reality of gravity. We know how to go beyond its limitations, how to counteract it. Likewise, I think there's an inevitable tendency for people to want to belong to a coherent group. A lot of that is to give a sense of self. And especially, Robin, to go to your question about teenagers. Teenagers have a strong need to shore up, strengthen their sense of self, and it comes with joining into tribes and groups. Now, critical thinking and tribalism are just opposed to each other, like Keith said, or Nietzsche actually talked about with political movements, the man who thinks himself straight through the movement. That's not a verbatim quote, but that's the gist. So the question is, how do you persuade a teenager that critical thinking is a good thing? They feel the pull of the tribe. They can see the sense in which belonging to a tribe or a small group is attractive. What's attractive about critical thinking? And that's a question I have not yet figured out as a teacher of theory of knowledge, to be honest. I can give lessons on critical thinking, but making it attractive, that's a different story. So maybe, Keith, if you've done sales, maybe you can say something about that.
I can say that you will never make it attractive. And at least by my estimation, this is I could be way off in this, and I pray that I am. But I think that critical thinking is painful for most people because, maybe for all of us in some respects, because a good critical thinker will constantly, every day, most of his relationships, most of the moments of his life, most of the decisions he makes will be fraught with standing contradistinct from the crowds, because the crowds, by definition, are not thinking critically. The mob rule that Franklin and Jefferson warned the United States about, and also ancient philosophers warned most of us about. The mob, and I talked with Robin a few days ago about the bell curve, and this is not to be really elitist in a negative sense, but the bell curve tells us one very important thing about humanity, and that is that not everybody is on the right side of the bell curve, meaning the elite 1% or less. Not everybody's on the stupid side, but the vast majority fall in the middle, and the middle is not either doesn't have the tools, doesn't have the desire, doesn't have the time, doesn't have the inclination to use the intellectual apparatus or tools that the other side, the right wing, the right side, not right wing, the right side of the curve uses. And that's something we have to accept. So while I try to teach my son and other young people and anybody I can come, have any chance with, that critical thinking is a valuable tool for themselves to not be swayed into mistakes that they will pay dearly for later, it still only applies to them, in their mind, as a means to an immediate end. In other words, critical thinking for its own purposes is not appealing. Critical thinking to avoid a negative outcome in their immediate life or circumstances is the only way to show them the relevance of critical thinking skills to themselves.
So I hear what you're saying, Keith, but I do at the same time strongly believe that we can show the beauty of critical thinking to our children. If critical thinking is seen and taught and lived out as a subset of wisdom, it's very possible to, and indeed necessary, to show our children that wisdom is beautiful. And this comes across in the wisdom tradition of the Hebrew scriptures, where wisdom is portrayed as a beautiful woman, and with metaphors that show that it's not just wisdom is not just the right thing to do. It's not just the right thing to do to go and get wisdom, but this is what a beautiful, flourishing life looks like. And if as parents we raise our children in a holistic with a holistic lifestyle where we're living out what we're teaching to them, and we're showing them that wisdom and critical thinking are part of the good life, part of what human flourishing looks like, then critical thinking can be situated within this larger context where they see it as beautiful. And some books that I would recommend that flesh this out are James K. A. Smith's series on cultural liturgies. That would, if, have either of you read, or are either of you familiar with his work? Okay, it's this basic idea that that values are transmitted to the next generation in a context where they're inculcated into the liturgies of our lives, so that we actually, on a gut level, we see these values as being beautiful. And I do believe that critical thinking can be situated within that context. Does that am I out in the skinny branches there, or does this make sense?
I have something to say, but I'll wait if Jason has a comment there.
Yes, beauty and wisdom, or the beauty of wisdom. I think these are important points that Robin is making. Actually, Robin and I had some conversations about David Hume's theory of ethics, in which he emphasizes the beauty of virtues. It's by presenting virtues as beautiful that people become attracted to them. And that's not going to happen abstractly. It will happen through stories or through these cultural liturgies that Robin mentions. And the connection between wisdom and critical thinking. So, for example, not just in Western civilization, but also in Middle Eastern civilization as well, which also took on Greek philosophy, the figure of Socrates, who did critical thinking, but we see the worth, the goodness of critical thinking in the life of Socrates. His death is a kind of martyrdom that establishes critical thinking as a strong value. With respect to intelligence versus wisdom, this, I think, is a very key point. So, Keith, you're talking about how people find on the internet maybe all kinds of different information. They don't know how to evaluate them or how to integrate them to a bigger picture. That's what wisdom is all about. And not even philosophers talk about wisdom all that much. This is one of the reasons why I have difficulties with things like the bell curve, because I'm not even sure that intelligence can be measured, put in metrics, and certainly wisdom cannot. And then with respect to intelligence, tribalism is very strong among the more intelligent people. What I've noticed again and again is that the people who are most likely to belong to cognitive tribes, this be thinking and talking in a stylized way of a particular group, are those who have a higher education. And there's this weird thing of, I'll be talking with someone who is creative, independent, unpredictable in their own field, just delightfully individually human. But then when politics comes up, they become robotic, or they're just repeating the same things and their individuality is lost. And no political side of the spectrum has a monopoly on this. There's just this tendency of the more intelligent to fall into this kind of cognitive tribalism.
Well, okay, wow. Okay, I'm going to go to where I was first, as a response to Robin first, and the idea of wisdom. And in the Western tradition and the Western monotheistic tradition. So using the Hebrew scriptures as a foundation, wisdom doesn't operate in those scriptures in a vacuum. So this is I think one of the problems for us, for we as parents, or for those that have a religious faith. One could argue, and probably would if they were of the Aryan persuasion during the Nazi era, meaning Aryan, though that they had great wisdom and had used fundamental knowledge and observations to make their decisions about where they lay on the spectrum of human development. So wisdom without a foundation is kind of not very helpful. In the Hebrew scriptures, wisdom doesn't come in a vacuum. It comes only from accepting the word of God as revealed to the Hebrews at the time. And there is no wisdom apart from that. So wisdom is applying those laws, which are in their mindset, indisputable, irrefutable, and divinely inspired to everyday life. And then you're a wise person. So wisdom without some kind of foundation doesn't really get anyone very far, because it only gets you as far as the foundation that you are basing your wisdom on. Wisdom is the proper application of the foundational worldview you have. If you have a poor foundational worldview, then you may be wise, but you'll be foolish. The other thing is, as far as tribalism, I don't think tribalism is bad. I think you're right, Jason. I think that everyone belongs to a tribe. Earlier, when very few people want to be the odd man out in their entire lives. I think that in our last week's discussion about tribalism, the more important thing is to be thinking about the tribe to which you belong. Who's setting the ground rules for that tribe? Do you really ascribe to those ground rules, and have you thought about them? Or are you just liking the way it feels to be part of this particular tribe and rub shoulders with these particular people, irrespective of the views that are being espoused? And that brings us to what you said, where people regurgitate the views of this tribe that may or may not even make sense in light of their intellectual capacity or the other parts of their lives, the way they live, et cetera. There's a cognitive and methodological and lifestyle dissonance between their tribalism and their individuality. So ideally, we belong to a tribe where our individuality meshes with the other parts of the tribe. And I think you find that in religious groups. It's probably why there are 20,000 or so Christian denominations, which I'm not a fan of, but it's all because of this tribalism approach that we want to share time and space with people we agree with. I think we need to teach people to think about whether or not they really agree with the tribe that they bought into. That's the bigger issue.
And we need to teach people how to communicate with people in different ideological tribes, because one of the ways you can notice whether someone has fallen victim to tribalism is how they interact with people from a different tribe. For example, are they able to listen attentively to other people's points of view? And the gold standard, as far as I'm concerned, on whether that's happening is if you can summarize your opponent's position in your own words in a way that he or she can say, yeah, that's what I'm saying. It doesn't matter how strongly you feel. For example, I'm pro-life. I'm very strongly pro-life. But if I'm talking with someone who's pro-choice and I'm not able to put in my own words what he or she is trying to articulate in a way that's fair and representative, then I have no right to publicly dispute what that person is saying. And so I would use that as a criteria of whether someone has succumbed to tribalism in the psychological sense, whether they are able to sympathetically characterize the beliefs of their opponents.
Well, I think tribalism, we need to remember, can be either savage or it can be edifying. So in the savage definition of tribalism, then it's one tribe against another. There isn't a middle ground. There is, you're wrong, I'm right, and my tribe's right, and we are going to destroy you. Or there is the idea that, I happen to disagree with you, and I've got a lot of people that are on my side, and we all seem to disagree with you, but I really want to hear, you seem like a really smart, wise person. I want to hear what you think. Maybe I'm wrong. Help me understand why you aren't part of this tribe. And I think that's kind of what you're saying. I want to know the people I enjoy speaking with the most are people that are smart, have thought through their issues, and disagree with me. Because those are the people I can hone my own values from and with, and maybe change some of them, because I certainly could be mistaken. And I think that's the problem when we fall into tribalism, where no, there is no mistake. I can't be mistaken. Then,
well, the problem is with what you're saying, Keith, is the reaction of the rest of the tribe. So that's really what was getting a lot of people. So on one hand, there's cognitive dissonance, the problem of, well, if I even listen to this other point of view, that's somehow going to threaten my sense of self, which is bound up with this tribe. But the other one is the negative feedback. We're especially seeing this in the age of social media tribalism. The very fact that someone is following or engaging in conversation with the tribal other immediately makes them vulnerable to accusations. Oh, well, you're a traitor. Like the joke, anyone who disagrees with me is literally Hitler. Well, are you a traitor just by talking with someone else? And just to be fair, I mean, this happens on all sides. Question. I'll give an anecdote and an example of how someone can counteract the natural movement of the tribe. So I went to a great liberal arts, Catholic, great books college, and we had a visiting speaker, Eric von Kindert-Ledeen, who was one of the original contributors to National Review and was one of the great conservative personalities of the 20th century. The very image of the Austrian, courteous, noble, Renaissance man, that was him. Genius in very talented in many different fields. And he came to Thomas Aquinas College and he was giving a lecture about his travels through the world of Islam. And this was before 9/11. And he gave this very vivid presentation of his journeys through different Muslim cultures. And then he gave a question. It really struck me because he admitted his ignorance. Because like Keith has been saying, if we don't know our limits, what we don't know, then we can't expand. He was one of the few speakers I ever heard who confessed his ignorance about the topic he was talking about. So he said, I've been through all these Muslim cultures, but I still do not understand why someone would be a Muslim. What's the attraction there? And I thought about it, and that's a really good question. If you cannot understand why someone is being attracted to their position, you don't understand anything about it. You don't have wisdom about it. You may know all the encyclopedia facts. You don't know the force behind it. So then I asked the question, and I was, as like I think pretty much like every young conservative male in his 20s, I'd been reading Nietzsche. And I brought up, well, what about, Nietzsche says that Christianity doesn't emphasize the martial values and Islam does. Perhaps that's something. Immediately, when I asked that question, the rest of the students laughed at me, or the majority of them did. Or maybe they laughed with me. It's hard to tell. But I felt an immediate embarrassment of, oh, no, I've gone outside the tribal boundaries. Then von Kindert-Ledeen came in. He said, don't laugh. He has a good hypothesis. So what he did was, here was somebody who is recognized as an authority by the tribe, and he used his position to protect the individual thinker and say, hey, tribe, he's one of us. What he's done, this critical thinking, is acceptable within the tribe. And then he went ahead and gave an answer. So we had a good dialogue. And, because of that, now I'm preparing to teach a seminar next week at the University of Tartu on Islamic philosophy. So, there were some results from that. But I think this is something we need to do, recognize the reality of tribal pressures and try to create the institutions or practices that will allow for individual critical thinking within those tribes.
Wow. That's a really good story, because it gets to the heart of what we can do to undermine the more pathological aspects of tribalism. Within our own tribe, we can encourage critical thinking. We can encourage people to ask questions. I try to do this as a parent, encouraging my children to analyze how and why they have the opinions that they do, including opinions they've got from me. But I find it's a balance, because with my children, I don't want them to just feel like they're drifting in this sea of of intellectual exploration, because it's important for their stability, both their psychological and spiritual stability, that they be securely rooted in their basic beliefs. But my goal is for them to hold those basic beliefs in a way that is thoughtful, reflective, and intellectually engaged. And one of the ways I've tried to achieve that is to let them know they can come to me with any question, any viewpoint, and it's okay, we'll discuss it. And even when they've come to a viewpoint that's different from my own, I try to emphasize that what is more important to me than what viewpoint they actually hold is how they've reached those beliefs. And so we have great discussions, especially when we're driving the car. And often my approach is, let's take a step back from this issue and think this through critically, rather than just this is what you should believe. Now, obviously, this has to be age appropriate, because this could be destabilizing for a younger child. And even with my teenagers, it isn't always appropriate, because sometimes they don't want to have a drawn-out discussion. They just want to know what dad believes and leave it at that. And that's okay too. But obviously, my long-term objective is to raise sons and daughters who are thoughtful, who are reflective, and who are engaged, and who will bring that posture towards any issue that might come up. And I know this has been a concern for Keith as a father, because I was talking last year with his grown son Jesse, and I asked Jesse, so how did you become a Christian? And Jesse shared with me that when his father got custody of him and began homeschooling him, every morning at 7 o'clock, it was the Bible and Plato's Republic. And through his exposure to these and other great texts, within the context of learning to think, Christianity became beautiful to him. Have I remembered that story correctly, Keith?
More or less. I mean, sufficient for a podcast, for sure. I think that that is very important. Not that I necessarily did everything right there, but that we can't just teach our children to think critically. Matter of fact, I would argue that maybe that was one of Socrates' greatest flaws. There was no, at least not apparently so, any foundational issues or truths that he was staking anything on. Mainly, he was undermining belief in the current truths. And as you know, since I'm a person of faith, as a Christian, I take and give more than a passing nod to the authority of various scriptural texts. I think that without a foundation, critical thinking is just an intellectual exercise. And who's going to say that Richard Dawkins isn't a critical thinker, or Hawking or Einstein? I mean, these people are bright people, but they start at a different place. And I think the biggest problem in modern culture, actually throughout history, but certainly in modern culture, is we argue about the minutia without dealing with the foundation. We've got to start, if you're going to teach your children to think critically, they have to have a foundation and a worldview from which to apply those critical thinking skills. Otherwise, sociopaths think critically. That's why they don't get caught. But I don't want my child to be a sociopath thinking critically. I want him to be a person who thinks critically from a good foundation. And we can't elevate critical thinking I don't believe we should elevate critical thinking to this level of some kind of demigod, if you will, that is worthy of its pursuit in and of itself. Go ahead.
I was thinking of what Chesterton said in Orthodoxy about the madman. He said the madman is not the one who has lost his reason. He's the one who's lost everything except his reason.
That's well, exactly. So, I think that you can teach people to think very, very well. We can look through history and see many brilliant thinkers that led society in very bad directions. And then we can see people that maybe didn't look like phenomenal thinkers, but led people in very good directions because their foundation was right. I look at, if we want to use the Hebrew scriptures, look at David and Solomon. Solomon was supposedly the wiser of the two, but he led his own life into total disarray. David, on the other hand, was the man who was rooted in the foundations of his faith and belief in God and made wise choices throughout his life, and maybe wasn't noted for his outstanding wisdom or critical thinking skills, but he was obedient to the foundation that guided his life. So I would much rather have my son be a David than a Solomon.
Very good. Jason, do you have it? That's a good note to end on, but do you have any final concluding words, Jason?
Yes. The importance of beauty, to go back to to your discussion last week about strengthening values in children, in the faith that we raise them in, and then also about the problems of the attraction of tribalism. A lot of what we make our choices on falls on our sense of beauty. What is beautiful? Because when we're thinking about things, when we're planning or looking at the different options, at that point, the attractiveness of something will draw us. So there's an attractiveness to tribalism. Whatever we want to find as a counter to that needs to have its own beauty displayed as well.
Yeah, that goes back to the idea of cultural liturgies and some of the work that the Christian philosopher James K.A. Smith that I mentioned earlier, or some of the work that he's been doing to explore how children are inculcated in the belief system through seeing that system incarnated into the rhythms and practices of life. Sadly, gentlemen, I'm going to have to stop us now because we're out of time, but I want to assure our listeners that we will be continuing to discuss these and other important issues in the days ahead so that you have the tools you need for flourishing as a human being in this sometimes confusing world that we find ourselves in. Feel free to post your questions on our Facebook page. And remember, the person who posts the best question will receive a free copy of Saints and Scoundrels, in addition to having their question become the topic of a future episode of this show.
Thank you for listening to today's broadcast. The Robin and Boom Show is made possible through the generous support of listeners like you. To become a patron of the show, go to robinmarkphillips.com and select the Robin Boom Show from the drop-down menu. If you have questions you'd like to have addressed on a future episode, send us a message through our Facebook page. Once again, thanks for listening.